that it wanted to expand Israel's Jerusalem border, and so they built this huge settlement right where it was, so they could argue, well, it's too late, we have too many people there, you just have to compromise and allow us to annex it and connect it to the rest of Israel. This is the E1 plan. This is the last area of undeveloped land to the east of Jerusalem. And like Har Homa, it's the last area of access from Arab East Jerusalem into the rest of the West Bank. So you can predict, of course, what Israel's going to do, right? They're going to build. They're going to construct. And Barak, he of the generous offer, annexed this land to Ma'ale Adumim, making the Adumim block one of the largest not the largest, but geographically in size larger than the municipality of Tel Aviv. But they don't really have a housing demand. So what are they planning on building there? Well, a few houses, a few new settlements, but also the Egged bus station headquarters, movie theaters, hotels, anything to fill up this land as quickly as possible to make sure that they can surround all of Jerusalem so that when the Israelis sit down and negotiate with the Palestinians, they can say, well, it's too late, we just have to take it. And the last slide I'm going to show you is Jerusalem to the north. Now here, the Israelis had a problem, because as you can see from Ramallah, where I live, all the way down into Jerusalem, you have a steady presence of yellow Palestinian towns and villages. So the Israelis couldn't build a block of settlements right in the middle, separating the Arabs of Ramallah from the rest of the Arabs in East Jerusalem. So what did they do? Well, they built two settlement blocks. The first one is the Givon block right here, then the Binyamin block right there. And most tellingly, they're connecting these two blocks with this new highway that's just recently been completed. If you take a look at this settlement, and it's this highway that's going to serve as Israel's self-defined northern border to Jerusalem, and not coincidentally, the wall that Israel has built separating Ramallah from Jerusalem is right here, this black line, just north of that highway. It's all part of a strategy. The wall, the highway infrastructure, the settlement infrastructure of a way of maximizing the land taken by Israel while keeping the majority of Palestinians out. Now, in this Binyamin block, you have about 6 settlements for only about 5,000 settlers. Why do you need 6 settlements for only 5,000 settlers? Well, the goal is to connect the dots. You're going to continue expanding all of these settlements till you have a solid wall of settlements to the east of Ramallah so that Ramallah cannot continue to expand. It's all part of the game of containing the Palestinians onto reservations while taking their land and continuing to build settlements. The BBC took this slide to the mayor of the Binyamin block. And they said, you know, this is what the Palestinians are saying you're doing. What's your response? And he says, why do you believe Arabs? They never know what they're talking about. They never get anything right. You can't believe a word they say. The block we're building is much larger than what they tell you on this map. They openly admit this, and this is reported by the BBC. This is not like a secret strategy. And even Mitznah, for example, he was the labor leader who ran against Sharon in the last election, and he's held as sort of like a left-wing savior, the peacenik. What did he say? What was his running platform? He said, I'll negotiate with the Palestinians, but if we can't reach an agreement, i.e., if they don't accept what I try to impose upon them, I will unilaterally separate, and I will build the wall in Jerusalem in such a way as to maximize the number of Arabs on the other side. That's Mitznah, that's the labor leader. They openly talk about what their motivation is. And Ehud Olmert said the same thing. In any final peace agreement, the parameters are clear. Maximum number of Palestinians on that side, maximum number of Jews on our side, no division of Jerusalem, no return to the 67 borders. And so when you know now what the paradigm is, you can translate everything Israel does. So when you hear that Israel is unilaterally pulling out of Gaza, is that really a cause for optimism? Well, no. That's part of the strategy. They don't want the Gaza Strip in the south anyway. So pulling out of Gaza doesn't do anything to convince me that the rest of the West Bank isn't going to be further colonized. When you hear that Israel's going to remove a settlement or a settlement outpost, you can guess where that settlement is going to be. It's going to be in that part that Israel is planning on making a Palestinian quote-unquote state. So when Israel removes the settlement, and of course they're going to make sure all the press is there to cover it, so don't be fooled, that settlement's going to be one of these small little isolated settlements here, here, here. It's not going to be Ariel. It's not going to be the settlement Ma'ale Adumim or anything else in East Jerusalem. They're happy to sacrifice a few of the settlements that are part of the Palestinian reservation state, but they're certainly not going to move away from this paradigm of taking as many of the settlements as possible. So you have to be clever. You have to understand what motivates Israel, and then you'll be able to understand everything Israel says it's doing. And know that it's all part of this strategy and not necessarily a cause for optimism. Now, I'm going to leave it on one final note. What I find so ironic about this entire strategy is that it's so self-defeating. Because while the Israelis are genuinely trying to get rid of these Christians and Muslims, they're making the situation so bad, and they have destroyed any faith in a viable two-state solution, that many Palestinians are now saying, you know what? We don't want a state anymore. Now that we know what's in line for us, you can have it. Take down your wall, you give us Israeli passports, and we'll see you at the voting booth as equal citizens of this state. So while Israel's trying to get rid of these people, they're only encouraging them to agitate for greater rights as equals within the same state, the exact opposite goal of what Israel's trying to accomplish by having a Palestinian state. And I thank you very, very much for your time. You've been extraordinarily patient.
Mr. Tarazi is happy to take questions. I suggested to him that I would ask you to keep your questions to a minute so they weren't debating lectures. He said I should be limiting you of time. But let's ask him really intelligent questions and a little more about what he has to say. Well, let's listen to each other.
Mr. Tarazi?
Yes.
You mentioned early on in your talk that you had, at one point, your job was to go into Israel and meet with Israelis in their homes and in theaters and at universities like this one. Is there anything in your experience that suggests to you that the paradigm you described tonight is not the way most Israelis feel, and that there is some hope that most Israelis would like to see some other paradigm, some paradigm that involves a true compromise with the Palestinian people?
No. The short answer is no. There was not a whole lot that convinced me the majority of Israelis adopt a different paradigm. In fact, it was precisely this part of my job that convinced me of everything I said to you tonight. Because I went there, and I grew up here in the United States, and I had Jewish roommates, and I dated Jews, and I think I went there with a sort of Pollyannish approach, like, we just need to talk. And so I said, okay, well, I'll do part of the talking. And I went there, and I realized they don't see me as equal. And this is what motivates them. And this is precisely these so-called left-wing Israelis who are motivated not by anything other than how do we get rid of you as a demographic threat, how do you preserve Israel as a Jewish state with democracy, and so if we have to give you a state, then we'll do it. Of course, there are Israelis that are very sympathetic, and there are Israelis who are not Zionists, who believe that this whole idea of a state based on one religion or ethnicity is retro and has no place in the modern world, but they are minorities. Yes, sir.
Mr. Tarazi, how is it that Bill Clinton was so deceived that he was totally unaware of the strategy you're talking about and the need for other things other than what the mainstream Israelis want to negotiate with the Palestinians?
You have to ask President Clinton. He was not necessarily deceived as much as he was blind to what the strategy was. He wasn't willing to go that extra mile and say, wait a minute, why are we negotiating in the first place? If under international law Israel doesn't have a right to any of this land, and if the refugees have a right to return, what are we negotiating? So I guess my question to President Clinton would be, why did you even negotiate? Why did you simply enforce the law the way you did in other places around the world?
Could it be that he has a different understanding of the situation?
He clearly does. As many Israelis have a different understanding. There's a lot of sympathy for this idea that Israel has to be a Jewish state without a great understanding of what that means to the Palestinian population. And I think President Clinton may have, although I'd have to ask him, have bought into that. His goal was not so much justice and the implementation of international law. I think his goal was, how do I get something out of this in order to say that I help create peace without paying attention too much to the detail. And I think Robert Malley also said that. I mean, he was one of the negotiators on the team, and he wrote an article and he said, we, the Americans, judged progress not by, or we judged it by how far Israel went, but not by how far Israel was supposed to go. How many more questions are you planning on asking, by the way? Because there's a whole There's a whole line, and you've already asked two, so I appreciate if you're respectful of the other people behind you.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
I know you're a slick Harvard lawyer,
Thank you.
but I think what you're doing is certainly it's hurting Israelis. And you know what?
It's what? It's what?
It's hurting the Israelis. It's hurting the Jews.
What I'm doing?
Yes.
What am I doing? It's hurting the Israelis.
Your talk, and it's hurting the Palestinians. And you know in your heart it is because there's these poor little kids, and they get educated. You know, they get educated in jihad. These little tiny kids. Why don't you? I'm talking about what happens to the education of the little children in the West Bank. You should. I mean, I don't know how you can.
What's your question then?
My question is, why did you put up a map at the beginning, which was not a map that was ever presented at Camp David talks, which is a map that was really distinct from anything that either Clinton or Dennis Ross had as an interpretation of the Camp David agreement. It was something that Palestinians only had developed. I mean, so this is the true map.
Now, you're absolutely right in that this was not a map presented at Camp David. This was a map the Palestinians actually created based on their understanding of Camp David. And we have repeatedly asked people, if they disagree with us and if we misunderstood, please present your own map, and they never have. So you have to ask the Israelis, why don't they just come up with another map? This would be very easy to refute. Let the Israelis come up with their map. Thank you very much.
Yes,
Thank-
the point is,
thank-
you know,
thank you. I think you can
I'm
do-
sorry too, and I
Yes.
hope you can sleep at night when the next little Palestinian kids get killed or when the
No, I don't think the Palestinians get killed.
Because it's your fault, it's people like you that are doing
I
it.
don't,
Be
you know,
slick, but this is what you're doing.
I really have to comment on that. And I do have to remind people that I will show respect while you ask the question, but I expect you to show respect when I'm answering the question.
But
And-
you're killing people.
It's ridiculous.
You know what? I don't have to answer that because you've actually made your whole point very clear. Go ahead.
Wait a second. We can do better, right?
I agree.
We don't need to take sides with that either. We can all, it's a university, we brought someone as a lecturer, we're not having a debate, ask a really good question, make it limited, and we don't need to call names, right? We don't need to do it.
Quick with Peter Minor.
Yes.
Thanks for putting no pressure on me.
My question was, given just the tense circumstances that have existed between Palestine and Israel throughout my lifetime, if you were given the sovereign state the ability to raise an army, secure borders, it seems that massive war in that would just be inevitable, in that you would be moving back towards 1948 borders within a short amount of time. And I just want to hear your comment.
I would disagree because I think that there is this concept and there's this false idea that Jews and Arabs just simply hate each other. It's just something they're born with, and they can never live at peace with each other. And historically, that's wrong. And I think today that's wrong. The reason there is tension between those communities is not based on innate hatred, and it's not based on indoctrination. It's based on the fact that there's a lack of equality. Blacks and whites in South Africa didn't innately hate each other. There was tension because one group had rights and another group didn't. And when you solve that problem, you don't have that tension anymore. When you have true equality, you don't have that tension anymore. And historically, Jews, Christians, and Muslims have lived in the Middle East on much better terms than they've ever lived together in the West, in the Christian West. Yes.
Regarding to the benefits of your talk, which is the paradigm of Israel and so on. There are many other instances in the world following World War II and so on. The world has determined that a much better situation for stability and peace is to divide people into countries, and rather than force them sometimes to live together, which is not a workable solution in many cases. And it appears that the Israeli-Palestinian case is a very similar one. And world stability and regional stability would be much better served if they are divided into two states and not one state, which would be, in effect, the Arab state number 22. Why do you keep refusing to that solution where it seems to be a much more viable and stable solution for the region and for the whole world?
It's a good question, but it's false. We don't refuse it. In fact, we keep talking about two states, and we, unlike the Israelis, have recognized Israel within 78% of Palestine that it took in 1948. There has never been an Israeli leader who has said that we recognize Palestine's right to exist on the remaining 22. Now, I think a 78-22% division is pretty fair. But as I pointed out, Israel wants two states. They're not based on equality and international law. They want two states because they need a place to get rid of us, and that's why it's being carved out the way it's being carved out. I think if there can be two states, it should be equal. Why not 50-50? Why 78-22? I think Palestinians have given up far too much as it is. But that's what international law says, and so that's what I'm willing to go by. But Israel insists on no. The whole point is to carve away this whole two-state idea. And what I pointed out was, what they're doing is they're destroying that two-state idea.
Well, I
Yes.
Very
Next question, please. Thank you very much for your question. Yes.
What I was just wondering is, this, at the beginning of this, we talked about understanding policy and foreign policy. My question centers on this plan that is in place, was constructed after a careful study of the U.S. reservations of for Native Americans. It
Yeah.
sounds very similar.
It's absolutely very similar. It is absolutely very similar. And it's so comparable to what happened to Native Americans. And what's interesting is that Native Americans, as bad as it was for them, ended up with at least equal citizenship and can vote in American elections. Palestinians don't even have that, and that's not even in the offering.
Two things. First off, you said illegal settlements according to international law.
Yeah.
How did those settlements come about? How did Israel move into West Bank from the 1948 borders?
From the 1947, there was the 67 war in which Israel
Yes,
took.
who started that war?
Israel launched the attack against the
Was that
Egyptian
a legal
Jordanian.
war according to international law?
I'm sorry.
Was that a legal war according to?
There isn't such a thing as a legal or illegal war. There is an occupation and there are rules governing
It's
occupation.
legal to be attacked. It's not illegal to defend yourself.
No, it's not a question of legality of a war or defending it.
Why did you say illegal according to international law so many times?
Okay, well, if you let me answer, I'll be happy to. All right? There's an occupation. I don't know about war, legal or illegal, but what you do is you have laws that govern what can be done during an occupation. Regardless of whether or not you buy into the Israeli mythology that they were just defending themselves, which of course is, I believe, wholly untrue and verifiably untrue. But regardless of whether or not they were defending themselves or whether or not there was a land grab, occupation and the laws governing occupation still exist, and that is a law under the Port Geneva Convention. That law says that an occupying army cannot an occupying power cannot transfer its civilian population into occupied territory. And that's what Israel's done. And this is not just me, it's also the UN and every other international body that's held that up.
Also, do you think the Palestinian government would accept return to 1948?
Return in 1940, you mean the 67 borders? Yeah, they've already announced that publicly. It's Israel that refuses to
What
accept
they
that.
have done?
But they never did. What do you mean? When what?
When the borders were set up, what did they?
In the partition plan in 47?
Yeah.
It's an interesting point. Back in 1947, basically the Israelis, or say the Jewish population of Palestine at the time, was approximately 35% of the population, most of whom were recent immigrants from Europe and from Russia. And the UN came and said, we're going to divide up Palestine. 55% for these Jews who only constitute 35% of the population, most of whom are immigrants, 45% for the indigenous Christian and Muslim population, and perhaps even for the Jewish population that was also part of the Palestinian population.
You're wrong there. Most of the land went to the Palestinians because you have to include Jordan in that, which was also created.
Okay.
Thank you.
If I can answer that question, in fact, the Palestine Mandate is what was going to be divided up, and that Transjordan was carved off from. So it was that Palestine that was divided up 55 and 45. I don't know why you would include Jordan, that was carved away. Why would you include Jordan, not Lebanon or Syria or Egypt? Yes, sir.
Almost 20% of the Israeli population is Arab population. And I'd like to ask you, how many Jews are there living in Jordan, Saudi Arabia, or anywhere in the 22 Arab countries? It doesn't seem to bother you, even though in those countries they can't even own land. Now, why are you so troubled and critical of Israel about its rejection of allowing repatriation of Palestinians when you know that if they had the repatriation, it would swallow Israel? It would just become another Arab state.
Well, the argument being what? That if we allow the indigenous population to remain, then you wouldn't have a Jewish state, which is what exactly I was talking about. The whole idea of how you define a Jewish state is one in which you control the non-Jewish population. Now, what happens if the Palestinian 20% inside Israel become 50%? What do we do then? Sterilize them? Deny them citizenship? And it's
They have
precisely
a right to vote.
that this exactly
They do now.
that now they do. But the
They have
first,
more rights to vote than anybody in the Arab world.
Let me interrupt for a second. We really had a good discussion. No, thank you. And I think it's been fine, and people are all listening. I would do this pretty well. We have two more questions to come.
well, I'd like to
And
answer
we're
that
already
question.
on reading for a long time, right, and understanding this and checking out each of these ideas, but it's going well. We have two more questions.
But I would like to answer that question, which I guess maybe or political statement, I don't know. But I understood the question there. I would wholeheartedly support the right of Jews if they want to repatriate to Arab countries. This is not about just simply Palestinians going to go to Israel. And in fact, Jews who are from the West Bank, who went to Israel in the war in 1948, also have a right to return to the West Bank. And that's also a Palestinian position. So this is not just about one way. I support everyone's right to return to their homes under international law. Yes?
It's very hard. It's very hard to obtain a number of points of view about the Middle East conflict. Number one, I'd like you to help me understand why it's so hard to hear a balanced presentation of Oslo or any of the other subsequent negotiations. And number two, how does a person who desires at least to know all points of view inform themselves, given that it's so hard to get anything from the dominant media in the United States?
It's a good question. There are a number of reasons why I think there is sort of a bias or a lack of information on the Palestinian perspective, particularly in the American media. If I can just address a few of those. One is that there is an infrastructural bias in Israel and occupied territories. When journalists come to Israel, they have to register with the government press office. The Israelis know who they are. They're appointed a little pager system. They are appointed somebody who monitors what they write. And those journalists are dependent upon Israel to be able to continue working there. So if they write something the Israelis don't like, they get a nasty phone call. And more than one occasion, I've had journalists, and in fact, it's even made the press inside Israel about the level of control the Israeli government exerts on journalists operating in the field. We Palestinians, because we don't control who can enter and not enter, who can work in the Palestinian territories, don't have that same amount of leverage over them. Another infrastructural bias is that journalists who live in coverage from the Middle East don't live in the occupied Palestinian territories. They live inside West Jerusalem or in Tel Aviv. They experience the conflict from an Israeli perspective. And I've heard after a suicide bombing, a journalist get up there and say, oh, and this happened just, a block away from where I do my shopping. They can personalize that, and they experience it from an Israeli perspective. There is no foreign journalist who lives permanently in the occupied territories, except for Israeli journalist Amira Haas, who lives in Ramallah. She's the only foreign journalist that I know of that lives on a full-time basis in the occupied Palestinian territories and experiences it as a Palestinian. And in fact, she experienced it so much, I once called her up and I said, she was on the other side of Ramallah. And it was when the Israelis had invaded her neighborhood, and I called her up and said, let's go out for dinner. And she said, I can't, I'm under occupation. So that was one of the rare moments that an Israeli tells a Palestinian that they're under occupation. To address your issue about where to go for sources, I don't believe there's any one particular source that I would go to, and certainly not any of the mainstream issues, for mainstream things for reasons I just spelled out to you. I go through a number of sources. Haaretz, I think, is one of the places that, at least purports to be, somewhat neutral. It's by far the most balanced paper inside Israel, but even they make a lot of mistakes. I also go to other sources like the Electronic Intifada, on the website. And they collect a lot of information and do a lot of research, and they present the Palestinian perspective. And they don't purport to be, balanced and fair. They're out to show you the Palestinian perspective. And I think that that's what you should, realize when you're seeing a various assortment of news outlets, that they all have some sort of bias, but some of them are just more open about that bias. I wouldn't go to Fox News, by the way.
Two quick questions. I'm curious about negotiations over the Gaza Strip.
Are you a journalist, by the way? That's what they always do. Two good questions. Go ahead.
My undergrad.
Yeah.
But one is negotiations with the Gaza Strip, and
Right.
number two is how do you solve the conflict over water? That seems to be what this.
A lot of it is, yeah. Let me address that question about water, because it really is so much of what's going on, even between Syria and Israel. When discussions with Iraq, and I believe it was in Hafiz al-Assad, were going on with respect to Syria, which you don't see on the Israel has already, this part that says Syria up there is also under Israeli occupation as well, because the other area that's under occupation is the Syrian Golan Heights, and Israel annexed that territory because there were few enough Arabs there that they could absorb the demographic quote-unquote threat. So when they were having negotiations with the Syrians, they said, okay, we'll withdraw, and I don't know if I'm getting this exactly right, but the Israelis said, we'll withdraw, but only, up to 1 kilometer of the Sea of Galilee. Meaning they were going to hold on to the border all the way around the Sea of Galilee. Now, the Syrians said no. And of course, it made it out to everyone in the world, see how unreasonable they're being. We offered them everything except this one little kilometer around the Sea of Galilee. Well, why is that so important? The Sea of Galilee is what gives you rights under international law to the water in the Sea of Galilee. And what Israel did is like, we'll give you this land, but we're not going to share this water resources. And so it was very much at the heart of the negotiations with Syria. With respect to the West Bank and the Palestinians, what's the solution for water? It's easy. International law specifically says all riparian states or shared water resources, all countries that border on shared water resources have to share them equitably and reasonably. And this is not a rocket science, it's basic fairness. The Nile River has several riparian, 9 riparian countries, and they all have agreements by which they're going to share the water resources. This isn't a question of not having solutions. The law actually provides for a solution with respect to shared water resources, but Israel's motivation isn't sharing. It's how do they get the water and leave the Palestinians on the other side, and that's what motivates them. During the negotiations, the Israelis say, well, we'll take all this water, and we said, well, what does that leave us? And they said, oh, don't worry, the Americans will pay for a desalination project for you. In other words, we'll take all the water, and you guys have to go desalinate somewhere, and it's your problem to find out how you're going to get the water. So that's how they wanted to solve that issue. And we say, look, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. International law already provides a solution. With respect to the issue of the Gaza Strip, Israel doesn't want the Gaza Strip. This is down here. It's about 1.2 million Palestinians, 80% of whom are refugees. And there's about 5,000 to 7,000 Israeli settlers who live on about 20% of that land. And the settlements are placed in such a way as, again, to divide up the various Palestinian areas. So 1.2 million people are held hostage by about 7,000 illegal settlers. And basically, Israel doesn't want it. I mean, Israel only built those settlements as negotiating leverage so they can say, oh, see, we're going to move out and see how great we are. And that's what they're doing right now with unilateral disengagement. They're moving out of the Gaza Strip, at least they claim they are, because they really never wanted it to begin with. It was just negotiating leverage. Yeah?
I wasn't here at the beginning, so I don't know if you spoke about it, but what is your solution for terrorism? How do you...
To address the causes of terrorism. I think far too often we are viewing this conflict and the violence of this conflict as simply Palestinians are indoctrinated. Palestinians are born with some gene that makes them hate Jews. There's just this, primal hatred between two people. That's not the case. When you give people a chance to live, when you give people a chance to live on an equal basis, and when you recognize their rights, you address the causes of terrorism. And so often we talk about the symptom of violence, and yet we don't talk about the underlying disease of occupation. We wouldn't have this violence if it wasn't for the occupation and the denial of freedom that the Israelis continue to impose upon the Palestinians. And I think to say otherwise is ignoring the reality of the situation.
As Israel and Palestinians were negotiating, and all this terrorism started, how can you keep negotiating this way?
Well, this is what's interesting. From 1997, the end of 1997, to the end of 2000 when the uprising broke out, for a period of 3 years, not a single Israeli civilian was killed inside Israel by an act of terrorism. You don't have to believe me. Go to the Israeli Foreign Ministry website, and you will see that there was no terrorism for that 3-year period. So what happened? Did the occupation end? Did the settlements stop? No. The settlements continued to expand. The occupation continued. More land was taken. More Palestinians were arrested. More settlements went up. So the Palestinians say, how can we continue to negotiate when we see what negotiations lead to? Thank you.
So it's legitimate things to go out, exploit yourself to negotiate?
Absolutely not. And I want to be very clear about that. I absolutely condemn the killing of innocent civilians. Whether they are killed by Palestinian extremists on the streets of Tel Aviv, or whether they're killed by the Israeli government with our tax dollars, they are both condemnable. I have to thank you very much, but no.
I'd like you to address the United States government. We have 2 candidates running for president, Kerry and Bush, and neither of them... Neither of them seem to be friends of the Palestinians or of equal just negotiations. And what happens when you talk to Congress?
Well, Congress members are not stupid. Well, some of them are stupid. But by and large, they're not stupid. I won't name names. By and large, they're not stupid. We regularly get congressmen who go through the Middle East to meet with us. And on more than one occasion, I have had Congress people come up to me and say, they take me aside and they're like, look, we know what's going on here. And we know that American policy isn't particularly helpful to the peoples of the Middle East, nor is it particularly helpful to American security either. But your side doesn't get us elected. They say it that bluntly. And so those who are concerned about the Palestinians need to make their concern very clear to their elected representatives. But it's got to be more than just be more fair, be more balanced. That doesn't help them at all. You've got to get savvy. You've got to produce votes. You've got to produce money. You've got to produce volunteers for their campaign. The other side does it. And that's why they get their voices heard. Even though they're a small fraction of the population, I think they're even a small fraction, as far as the Jews who are supporting Israel are a small fraction of the Jewish population in the United States. We have now Christian fundamentalists, Christian Zionists, who are out there among the harshest pro-Israel lobbies. But they get their voices heard because they're able to deliver. And so when you call up your congressman, it can't be just, I wrote a letter. It's got to be part of an organized effort in which that congressman knows you can deliver something other than just a complaint letter, but that you can actually make them pay one way or the other. Thank you all very, very much for your time.